Okay. I've had a number of people ask me, well, were you in the unions? Somebody yesterday, actually, before the presentation, walked up and thanked me for being a union organizer. And no, she was genuine, you know. And no, I was in a union for one summer, my last summer job. And this isn't really as much union, or my interest isn't as much specifically union, but it's, you know, people fighting for bettering their lives, being, having courage. I've always been kind of fascinated with that. As, you know, Peter asked me earlier, you know, what, maybe is it your political leanings a bit? And yeah, I think so. Thinking more of being on the side of the people rather than on the side of the power. Somewhere along the line, I found out about the Wobblies, and one of my sources there is a 100th anniversary of the Wobblies, a illustrated book, and kind of let me think I knew a lot about this stuff. And then when I start researching it, I find out I didn't know very much at all. And so I might stumble around a bit and have to pay more attention to my notes than usually I like to do. So yesterday, I want to give you a quick summary. What we covered yesterday, if you weren't here. Labor organizing began very quickly when the country was born, when we were colonies. I think it was 1648 was the first guild that came along, and these were skilled laborers oriented. It wasn't until the 1800s that we started having unskilled labor being involved in mills. The early guilds, they wanted to protect their craft, if you will, not allow unskilled labor to be, giving some diluted sort of product out there, be able to kind of control their prices. And they actually, early on in that 1700s, they were interested in promoting shorter hours. But any kind of activity was really kind of sporadic. Here and there was something. And besides protecting themselves, they did have an interest in a just society. They wanted to promote the idea that labor had value in itself, and if you could earn a decent wage with labor, that you would have a independent population, that they could take care of themselves, and you'd have a stronger nation. But when people started to see what was happening in England with the Industrial Revolution there, the kind of job conditions that were happening, the low wages, the long hours, the slums that started to develop in the cities, that the labor leaders here started to take the viewpoint that this was going to create two classes of people. An income disparity, just like we're talking about now, a rich and the poor. So that generated more activity, more organization, to where then we started to see some strikes happening. And usually these strikes failed. And the people who organized them got fired, they got blackballed, no gains were made, or a few gains. In some cases, they may regain wages that have been cut back, but there'd be no real official recognition of them as an organization, as a body that had some kind of legal reason to exist. And this lack of recognition, this inability to make real gains, was also the court systems helped to promote this, with looking at unions as conspiracies to restrain trade and to incite riot and mayhem type of thing. Women were also a part of these movements in the 1820s. I think it was 6 million in the early or mid 1820s to the 30s. There were like 6 million people in the workforce. And of that, 500,000 or 600,000 were women as domestics, and textile workers, and I forget the other category right now. Pardon? And teachers. How could I forget teachers? I have two teachers' daughters. And something I forgot to cover yesterday about the women, and I want to bring that up. We were talking about the opportunity to show a picture here. So there's the Lowell girls. Women came to Lowell, Massachusetts to work in the mills, where there were dormitories for them, matrons to oversee them, food to be provided, but conditions ended up becoming sort of jail-like after a while, and they ended up organizing. But here's what one of my sources said about women, like, why would they come to Lowell? And they did it of their own accord for various reasons, like to pay for college for their brother. There were some educational opportunities in Lowell, to earn supplementary income for themselves at half the wage the men were paid. Even though that was the case, that did give them some independence from controlling fathers and husbands. And it enabled these women to challenge the assumptions of female inferiority and dependence. Figure where I'm going with the rest of the summary. So we took some time to explore where socialism and anarchism fit into these labor struggles, because once you start reading about them in the about the labor movements and our history as a country, you start seeing the word socialism and anarchism popping up. Well, in 1848, there was widespread kind of rebellions across Europe, and one of the places that was occurring in were the German states, and we experienced a large influx of German immigrants from the 1920s through the 1820s to the 1860s, and they brought with them these rebellious ideas that included socialism, and then fairly tightly in contact with that, like going back to Karl Marx's first International, the International Assembly of Communists and Socialists, that on his side of their political spectrum, he promoted trying to make changes by the ballot, working within the system. There was another person named Bakunin who was opposed to that, who thought stronger, more direct, aggressive type of things needed to happen, and that was sort of the beginning of this anarchist movement. Interesting, though, that anthropologists tell us that anarchy, if you will, is really a characteristic of the way we as human beings lived for thousands of years in relatively non-hierarchical associations. And this morning I'm thinking about an example would be SSI. You know, we've got a board, we've got some officers, but, you know, that nobody's really told what to do. We run this place pretty much by ourselves, and I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, that anarchism isn't just the bomb throwing, the terrorist type people, but actually the political origin of that name really comes from rebelling against the state, saying the state doesn't have any authority over human beings. And then that did get taken fairly quickly to a statement called the propaganda of the deed, and it was heavily advocated by an Austrian named Johann Most, and which is really saying terrorism needs to be done in order to eliminate opponents of changing the system and activating everything. So anarchists actually were heavily involved into the 1860s and 1880s, with one of them who had happened to be a Confederate soldier originally and moved up to Chicago and sort of became converted to socialism. He was involved in the 8-hour movement, trying to coalition of groups came together in the U.S. to promote an 8-hour workday, and he helped organize a march in Chicago on May 1st, 1886, and this march had 80,000 people in the streets going down Michigan Avenue in support of the 8-hour day. It became the first May Day parade. And unfortunately, what followed that was a bomb exploding 3 days later at a rally that was in protest of some strikers that had been killed several days before. That bomb killed I think 17 or 7 policemen and wounded 50. The police started firing into the crowd, and we have this infamous Haymarket Square riot, Haymarket Square in Chicago. And that particular event really catalyzed the whole movement, and also radicalized some people we'll hear about later. So that brings us up to date here to where we are. But my notes aren't open to that, so I'll have to take a moment here here we go. Yes, this is... So you prepare yourselves. So 1886, considered the year of the Great Uprising of Labor. In 4 years, 81 to 85, 500 strikes a year, 150 workers a year are being involved. In 86 alone, 1,400 strikes, 500,000 workers involved. So, we've been going along a little bit here, a little bit there in the 1700s, a little more in the early 1820s. Civil War kind of slowed things down, has created some sense of unity, and plus people made real gains during the Civil War through the war economy. But then after that, things started to tick up and down again, and then we come to 88 or 86, and it's kind of boom, we shoot on up. And it wasn't a friendly sort of environment on both sides. This historian here is saying that we had a social war breeding here in the United States, a frenzied hatred of labor for capital. Extreme bitterness manifested itself. And this Knights of Labor, that came about several years before a major organization that had some success and enrolled a large cross-section of people, blacks and women, skilled and unskilled in their union. But this Haymarket bombing, there was rumor that the Knights were somehow involved with that. Nobody really knows to this day who set that bomb off, but there was rumor that the Knights were involved, and so their influence had really started to decrease. But this wasn't only in the North. Blacks and Southern whites also started getting involved in strikes, and specifically against the Southern system of convict labor. When they didn't have slaves, fairly quickly it was, well, we can hire out of the jails convicts at fairly low cost to us to do the work, and it gives some money back to the jailers and things. So there was incentive on both sides to have this system working. In 1891, at the Tennessee coal mine, the workers were told they had to sign an ironclad contract. You had to pledge no strikes, payment only in company script, not U.S. dollars, and no right to check the weight of the coal that you just pulled out of the mine. They were paid by weight, but you couldn't check it. And so the miners refused to sign this. They were evicted from their company home, and convicts were brought in to replace them. Well, we become very domesticated as a population in comparison to what we see. 1,000 armed miners took over the mine. They released the convicts. They burned the stockade where the convicts were kept, and the company surrendered. Similar incidents happened the following year. 1886 saw Samuel Gompers form the American Federation of Labor, AFL, which we still have with us today. And it's really the bones of the Knights of Labor. He says the various trades have been affected by the introduction of machinery, the subdivision of labor, the use of women's and children's labor, and the lack of an apprentice system, so that the skilled trades are rapidly sinking to the level of pauper labor. And so they're creating an organization for skilled labor to uphold standards and to keep us out of beggary. Gompers was an immigrant, came as a boy from London, and he ended up in the cigar making trade. Interesting job. He read, well, actually, this is where he got his education. He read books, newspapers, stories, poetry, and magazine articles to the employees to decrease their boredom while they were making cigars. Let's move up here. Oh, and here's a picture of Sam. It's not very clear. Business wasn't going to take any of this lying down. And one of the key tools that they ended up using was the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was, made to stop the monopolies from occurring, but fairly quickly was used against the unions as, they're trying to monopolize the labor and such. And particularly against the smaller unions. Court injunctions were another tool that the businesses were able to use. That usually and almost automatically compliant judges would issue an injunction against a strike at the request of government officials or corporation. As an example of this, I'm going to jump ahead a few years to 1902. There's in Danbury, Connecticut, the Hatters Association, hat makers, they called for a national boycott against a non-union company. That company sued in court under the provisions of the Antitrust Act that they were conspiring to restrain that company's trade. Well, the company lost, but in going through the court system over 6 years, it got to the Supreme Court, who ruled 5-4 in favor of the company, and on the basis that the Hatters Union had participated in an illegal secondary boycott. And secondary boycotts were subject to federal injunctive restraint. A clear signal to the rest of the judiciary and corporations that injunctions could be used to stop various kinds of strike and labor actions. So by the late 1800s, we had powerful corporations with heavy financial support, resources, and a history of active, with this strike breaking type of stuff and sending in the militia and the federal troops that we had talked about in the first session, and passive support of the government and its police forces, with backing of much of the press and the general climate. And as Peter and I were talking earlier, it's like, why is it so easy for the general public to see ill of people who are trying to better their lives in these organized movements? So it became a perfect climate for union busting and violence. Oh, get back here. Oh, there's the stuff on the Danbury thing. Which then brings us to Carnegie Steel and Homestead, Pennsylvania. In 1891, Henry C. Frick, who was the manager of Carnegie Steel, maybe the CEO, something along that line, he broke a strike that was attempting to get an 8-hour day. So in 1882, he decided that he had the opportunity to really break the union. And they imposed this wage reduction, 18 to 26%. And forget the name here, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers struck, just like he expected him to. And they walked out of the plant to be confronted by a fence 3 miles long surrounding the plant, 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, and with gun slits. Well, they persisted in organizing. They patrolled around the plant, and it was along the river. And as a means of trying to break the strike, that a barge full of Pinkertons. Everybody know who they are? The detective agency, I think the ones who chased Butch Cassidy across the desert, kind of the deal. A barge full of Pinkertons came down the river and were met by this huge crowd. Well, gun battle breaks out. And we have a running battle that occurs. We got 7 workers killed, 3 strike breakers, and scores are wounded. We got the National Guard comes in, and strikers are arrested, tried for murder and treason. And friendly juries wouldn't convict them. These trials happened kind of boom, 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 The strike was broken by bringing in trainloads of strike breakers and the fact that the other Carnegie plants kept working. Following the strike, unions made no gains in Carnegie Steel well into the 20th century. A self-proclaimed anarchist named Alexander Berkman tried to assassinate Frick. and only wounded him. Got sent to prison for a number of years. He was the paramour, a longtime friend of an infamous anarchist named Emma Goldman, who originally had emigrated here from Russia. And as part of this anarchism business is, kind of like total personal freedom. So she and the Confederate soldier, Albert Parsons, that led the May Day parade, he was married to Lucy Parsons. Well, they ended up during this time, Emma was gained fame by going around and speaking to large audiences about anarchism and feminism and birth control. I think she got thrown in jail for a period of time for espousing birth control. But she and Lucy also would argue in their paper about sexual freedom and free love. So in 1893, we've got a depression in the United States. 3 million of 15 million population are unemployed. Mass demonstrations. There's no state aid. Soup kitchens are set up in cities and localities. Homeless are sleeping in city halls and police stations, and there's waves of strikes that are going on. At this time also, 2,000 rail workers are killed per year. 30,000 are injured per year working on the railroads. The company said, this is just, these are acts of God, or these people are really careless. Well, the workers said, no, this was because of an undermanned workforce, double duty with loss of rest and sleep. So we come to the Pullman strike that begins in 94 when a grievance committee was fired in protest of like 5 successive wage reductions. The impression I get, and I didn't research beyond this impression, is that maybe these wage reductions, because that seemed to be a common theme. It's like all of a sudden your wages are cut. That it may have been a precursor to layoffs, if you will. So that instead of throwing somebody out on the street, they maybe thought they were doing better by cutting everybody's wages and keeping them at work. I don't really know. But wage reductions, and so these people are fired, and Eugene Debs ends up heading the American Railroad Union after some career in just working with the railroads, and orders this nationwide boycott. The General Managers Association, so of the different rail lines, the general managers had an association together. They hire, the figures seem to differ depending upon the resource, from 2,000 to 3,400 special deputies to break the strike, but are unsuccessful with that. Court injunctions come out. But the strikers ignore them. They're blocking trains. We've got burning rail cars. So state militia is brought in, and then eventually federal troops. There is a court injunction for the sympathy strikers, and that with that injunction, the sympathy strikers did go back to work. But while that was going on, we've got ongoing battles in different places in the country. 13 people killed, 53 seriously wounded, 700 arrested. 14,000 police, militia, and troops crushed the strikes. Debs was arrested and sent to prison for 6 months. This is that evil Debs. Somebody looks so harmless. Anyway, he started work in the railroads early on, and then went off and did other kinds of jobs and wandered around. Came back, and he did rejoin the railroad. Actually, the Railroad Brotherhood, and worked as a billing clerk for them. Initially, he saw no inherent conflict between capital and labor. But following Homestead and some events up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho at a mine, this is one of the things he said. If the year 1892 taught the working men any lesson worthy of heed, it was the capitalist class, like a devilfish, had grasped them with its tentacles and was dragging them down into the fathomless depths of degradation. To escape the prehensile clutch of the monsters constitutes a standing challenge to organized labor for 1893. Then he says again later, because when he was in prison, he started to study socialism. Hadn't really considered himself a socialist before that, but then came out of prison, converted to socialism. And he says the issue is socialism versus capitalism. I am for socialism because I am for humanity. We have been cursed with the reign of gold long enough. Money constitutes no proper basis of civilization. Now, I don't know, I'm not trying to promote socialism, not trying to convert anybody in anything politics-wise, but just those last two phrases, if you eliminate, socialism, capitalism, or any of those isms out of it, they ring with me, cursed with the reign of gold. Money constitutes no proper basis of civilization. Somewhere along the line, I think I remember someone in history that were fighting the British in maybe the 1700s or something like it's just a nation of shopkeepers, and what do we're all focused on the businessman. You can be better than have your own business or have a really big business and have a lot of money. When a national disaster happens here, we basically count it in dollars lost. Poorer countries end up counting it in thousands of people being lost. Debs ran as socialist candidate 5 times in the United States, hardly gaining any votes, and ended up arrested a second time when he was against the World War I. So it's Coeur d'Alene. Out west, here we've been talking about the railroad unions, earlier the AFL, which covered more of factories, and then the steel workers. And out west, we had the Western Federation of Miners. In 1892, at Copper Mine, we got a strike with gun battles between strikers and strikebreakers. Again, National Guard, federal troops, 600 miners are in prison. Scabs are brought in, union leaders are fired, and the strike is broken. The Western Federation of Miners are involved in what's later called the Colorado Labor Wars. These go on in 03 and 04 and take the lives of 30. So Big Bill was one of the primary leaders of the international workers of the world. And I guess I wasn't really clear. They're the Wobblies. And nobody knows where that word really came from. You could kind of see it with that IWW, but there's no real story of the origin of that word. Bill was one of those who got radicalized with the Haymarket Square riot, and then along with the defeats that were happening to the Western Federation of Miners, and it led him to push this idea of the one big union, but radicalized enough that they saw even working in cooperation with the employer as something undesirable, that there was no common interest. They felt that the AFL and other unions like it were aiding the employing class and misleading the workers into the belief that there was common interest. The fact that, if we can make the business better, that'll be better for the laborers. So, but that was no good. Learning about Big Bill mostly following a couple of strikes that he was involved with. So in 1912, in Lawrence, Massachusetts, a strike begins, and this is the strike started because the state legislature of Massachusetts decreed that the work week should be reduced from 54 hours to 52. So the mill owners said, well, ABC, they did their algebra, and they came up with, that should mean a 3.5% wage reduction. And that was instituted across the board. So 50,000 textile workers walked out, and the IWW was called in and helped to run the strike after it began. We have police and militia attacking peaceful meetings. In this case, there's broad public support for the strikers. And the strike's dragging on, and Bill's trying to figure out what to do to try to break the stalemate, if you will. And he hears about in Europe that a tactic that had been kind of successful, where the children of the strikers were adopted to sympathetic families that could keep them clothed and fed while the strikers were starving out there in the street with their pickets, if you will. So he advertises in socialistic newspapers and that, and gets families in New York and Connecticut to volunteer to take these kids in. And they make a big publicity thing of this, the mothers and the children going to the train and the tearful parting and the kids going off. So basically, in a couple of shipments, it was like 400 of these that happened. And the public is going, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And the leadership of Lawrence thinks, we got to stop this. This is making us look really bad. So the next time that this is going to happen, the police move in and they start clubbing kids and mothers and pulling the kids away from the mothers and stuff like that, and it becomes this tremendous publicity fiasco for them that even some of the kids were jailed, if you will. So a national outrage. The New York World wrote, the Lawrence authorities must be blind and the mill owners mad. The New York Tribune called the police response as chuckle-headed an exhibition of incompetence to deal with a strike situation as it is possible to recall. So the strike ended on March 12th with the owners agreeing to all the demands of the strikers. So that was some success for Big Bill and the IWW. So then we move on to the next big event, the Patterson Silk Strike, the next year. At this strike, 1,850 of the workers were arrested during the course of the strike. It was a long holdout, and the strike ended in failure. But Bill got some real notoriety with his next publicity stunt. They staged a pageant, a play of showing the strike in Madison Square Garden, and brought in the real strikers to play the roles of what was happening and the getting arrested and that kind of stuff. Even though the strike was a failure, Bill became a real celebrity in progressive circles and hobnobbed with individuals that maybe was like similar to during the 60s and 70s with the Vietnam War. You know, there were certain celebrities and that like would take in the Black Panthers and such. Moving on. We were discussing, some of us at the break, about, what might be situations where you don't need a union versus where you might. And I think it's, it's conditions, it's the way people are treated, in my opinion. Here is some remembrance from a person who was a child at the time, working in a sweatshop in New York. And in the early 1900s, sweatshops were proliferating in the garment industry. Dangerously broken stairways. There were few windows, and the ones we had were really dirty. The floor was swept once a year. Hardly any light, just gas jets burning day and night. The lavatory was filthy, stunk in a dark hall. No fresh drinking water. Mice and roaches. Suffered from the cold in the winter, suffered from the heat in the summer. And in these disease-breeding holes, men and women and children toiled from 70 and 80 hours a week, Saturdays and Sundays included. A sign would go up on Saturday. It said, if you don't come in on Sunday, don't come in on Monday. Children's dreams of a day off were shattered. So in 1909, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union struck. They thought they might get 3,000 people involved. They got 20,000 walking out and marching in the streets. They demanded a pay cut, a 20% pay raise in a 52-hour work week. They shut down 500 factories during this time. This was considered, this uprising of the 20,000, that's what's remembered as the largest labor action by women in our history. Some demands were met, but the actual sweatshop conditions didn't change. So that led us to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire as a consequence. These are shirtwaist workers. 149 of them died in a fire in 1911 on the New York's Lower East Side. They were on the floors 8, 9, and 10. The fire ladders only went up to floor 7. The code said doors should open outward. These doors opened inward. Plus, doors were locked so that people couldn't steal the goods. And that's where I should probably put a period. Other than I see here where somebody's going to be speaking on Frances Perkins this term, I believe. Well, she was a state investigator that was later to become Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, and she followed up on this fire.
Isn't that fire thought to be the instigation for OSHA?
I don't know that.
I'm wondering. It's always brought up in the same breath.
Is it? Okay. Then we have the Ludlow Massacre. This involved a mine owned by John D. Rockefeller. and this is in Ludlow, Colorado. The miners, let's see, they were, I don't have the reason why they struck, but they did, and they were immediately evicted from the company town. Their homes were company homes. So they moved off to a section of land and created a tent city to live in while they tried to conduct their strike. The National Guard was called in and surrounded the camp. It would periodically shoot into the camp at night. And so the miners dug some caves, some holes underneath their tents to protect the kids and the women. On Easter, company thugs, maybe some National Guardsmen poured oil on the tents and started a fire. As the people ran out of the burning tents, they were machine gunned. This was such a stain on Rockefeller's reputation, he hired a publicist to rebuild his reputation. And till he died, he was handing out shiny new dimes to kids and sort of to rebuild his reputation. But one positive thing was also that this apparently prompted him to become very philanthropic and promoted that within his family, so that the Rockefellers became the most philanthropic family in the United States. But it's the violence and viciousness of putting down these attempts to earn a little more money or have a better working condition. Unparalleled resistance from the federal, state, and local governments, company management, using labor spies and vigilantes is what the IWW experienced. Joe Hill. People have any awareness of this name? Well, he was a wobbly. He was an immigrant, came to town, came to the country. I think it might have been in Sweden. Pardon? Norway? And Hegeland was his name. And over time he changed that. He identified himself as a member of the local chapter of the IWW in Portland, Oregon. And he rose in the organization, but really became kind of the balladeer, the poet of the movement. He used familiar melodies and popular songs and just put in different lyrics. So I sort of think of him, this is probably not very respectful, if you will, but kind of like the Weird Al Yankovic of the Wobblies. One of the phrases he coined is "pie in the sky." His song that was in the song "The Preacher and the Slave." Another song he wrote was "Casey Jones, the Union Scab." So he showed up in a doctor's office with a bullet wound in Utah. Just after a businessman had been shot on the streets and robbed. He was arrested, charged with this particular murder. The son, who was there with the man who had been murdered in the street, first said, "Well, that's not the guy." And then quickly, along with, I think, like 13 other witnesses or so, said, "Yeah, he's the guy." His defense attorney said they wanted to keep his affiliation with the IWW out of the trial, but that wasn't possible. The newspapers made a big deal of that, and basically the thought is he was convicted and executed by firing squad just because he was a wobbly. He wrote to Big Bill before he was executed. It says, "Goodbye, Bill. I die like a true blue rebel. Don't waste any time in mourning. Organize. But could you arrange to have my body hauled to the state line to be buried? I don't want to be found dead in Utah. A little closer to home, as part of this suppression that was promulgated against the IWW in Everett, Washington, 1916. A sheriff attacked Wobblies on a steamer out in the Puget Sound. Killed at least 5 of them. 6 more were never accounted for. Figure it, they're at the bottom of the Puget Sound. A couple police officers were killed, and a deputized citizen of the National Guard was also killed. 5 civilians that happened to be on the boat were injured. So there was the sense that these people are too radical, they need to be suppressed, and World War I comes along. Bye, Joe. So when World War I breaks out, the AFL gets together with the federal government and Woodrow Wilson and says, we're going to make sure that production goes on, that there isn't going to be disruption by strikes, and we're going to cooperate. We're really behind the war. We're behind the country. So what do the Wobblies do? They come out with a resolution against the war and really inflamed the feelings against them, all the way from, the White House down to the man on the street. As part of the cooperation that the AFL did, they even participated in a wartime disputes board that would mediate and avoid strikes and keep the production going. This then led to, I think, Wilson even attending an AFL big convention. The first time a president would do that, attend anything with a labor organization, and that from there, the continued, presidents visiting and working with the unions and soliciting their support became a usual thing. With this anti-war stance, we had raids, arrests, and convictions. This may be very hard to see. This says, made in, this is a political cartoon at the time, made in Germany. And this, it's surprised he doesn't have a little pointy spy hat or something on, but it says IWW plots of the bomb. I have another one here in this publication that shows the Kaiser being IWW. And I couldn't get this down in the right size to make it as an actual slide. So in 1917, the Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917, and the government moved against the IWW. They raided all the offices that they could get their hands on and seized documents, and then arrested 166 IWW leaders for conspiring to hinder the draft, to encourage desertion, and intimidate others in labor disputes. 101 went on trial en masse. And this trial went on for like 4 months, the longest one that we'd had up to that time. The defense attorney was a attorney out of Seattle, George Vanderveer. His name pops up again later. He must have, that doesn't ring a bell with anyone. And I didn't go try to find out more about him. Anyway, they were all convicted quickly enough that it only was the jury would have deliberated for just a few seconds on each man, if you will. And the judge was Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Didn't he become a baseball commissioner?
Yes.
Yeah. So he released Big Bill Hayward on bail. And Big Bill took off to Russia and remained there for the rest of his life. And as a part of this crackdown on the IWW, it was certainly also the beginning of the Red Scare. The IWW was a wing of the Bolsheviks, and not only were they supporting Germany, but they were promulgating the same kind of rebellion and economic changes as the Bolsheviks were done. Again, I don't know if anybody could read all that, but it says, this country is unhealthy for every kind of Bolshevik, Reds, agitators, disorganizers of our labor or our business. So this brings us closer to home, to Centralia, Washington, Chehalis, Washington. Remember, there was up in Everett, Washington, up on Puget Sound, was the sheriff and some vigilantes killing some wobblies and throwing others into the Sound. Well, in Centralia, we have what some people call the Centralia Massacre, or others, it's the Armistice Day Riot. This occurred on November 11th, 1919. Celebrating the first anniversary of the armistice of World War I. It resulted in 6 deaths, people wounded, multiple prison terms, and to this day, I think a bitter dispute about who started it and why and this kind of thing. A culmination of years of bad blood between the local Foreign Legion and the IWW. And as I said a little bit earlier, there was this sense that the Bolsheviks and that the IWW's intentions were similar to the Bolsheviks. And some of this is from the constant allegations that was the case. Union members are being arrested around the country on sedition charges, and the business owners of Centralia and American Legions in particular believed Wobblies to be un-American and possibly treasonous. So, a little more background on this. In 1918, the Wobblies did have a union hall in Centralia. It was raided, and the Wobblies that the crowd and the police could get their hands on were drug out of town and beat up and told, don't come back into town again. Well, within the year, the Wobblies did establish another union hall. A Centralia lawyer that had some sympathy to them had suggested, when asked, said that, well, yeah, I guess it's okay if you guys defend yourself if you're attacked. And apparently the Wobbly leadership, because they were so worried about another raid, a recurrence of what happened in the year before, they armed themselves. And the American Legion was led by a very well-respected kind of hero of World War I. He had been a local football star and an All-American at the University of Washington. He had been with the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia, and they were protecting the Trans-Siberian Railroad during the fighting that went on between the Reds and the Whites and other groups in Russia after the revolution. And he had given at least one public speech about the evils of the Bolsheviks based upon his experiences in Siberia, and was known to be strongly anti-WW. So on Armistice Day, the town leaders of Centralia combined with the neighboring city of Chehalis to have festivities and have a parade. There were rumors that this was amongst the Wobblies, that lumber companies and local business leaders wanted to repeat the throw them out of 1918, and we're going to use the Armistice Day parade as the excuse. There were also rumors or stories that said members of the Legion were seen during the parade marching with rubber hoses and gas pipes, and the postmaster and local minister were supposedly seen carrying nooses. So the Wobblies, in preparation for the parade, because it was going to go right past their hall, stationed men across the street and in different places with rifles. So there's people in Chehalis that says the Wobblies were looking for a fight, and they were setting up a free fire zone. They weren't trying to protect themselves. And then during the trial that occurred, again, this is where George Vanderveer shows up again. He came up with the theory that you couldn't blame the Legion for going after the Wobblies and starting it this way, that there was a group of men did seem to go charge the Wobbly Hall that started the shooting and everything, but they were really members of the Centralia Citizens Committee acting on the behest of the president of the Eastern Railway and Lumber Company. Well, this Warren Grimm, the very well-respected Legion commander, was the first one shot. And that's part of where the people of Chehalis and the American Legionnaires feel that he had already been singled out by the Wobblies for his anti-Bolshevik, anti-Wobbly stance, and this was all planned. So the Legionnaires are charging the hall, more shots are fired, and a Wobbly named Wesley Everett runs out the back door with a gun and ends up in the middle of, I think, the Chehalis River, or Centralia River, the Chehalis River, and I think at that point, then he's faced with somebody who thought he had a working gun, but it didn't, and so the Wobbly shot him, and then part of the arguing about what happened is saying that he then got out of the river and pistol whipped this man who was still alive before he is captured and arrested. So he and a number of other Wobblies are thrown into jail. Well, that night, the electricity goes off in Centralia. And in the dark, a mob shows up at the jail and pulls out Wesley. He's the only one they grabbed. Apparently, they felt confident that they could identify him, and they took him to the Chehalis River Bridge and lynched him. And then cut him down and drug him back and left him in front of the jail. So 5 Wobblies were convicted, charged with murder, and convicted and given prison terms of 25 to 40 years. A sentence that apparently shocked even the jury as well as the prisoners. Eventually, some of their sentences got overturned by a governor later in 1933. If you go to Centralia today, you'll see a bronze statue of a doughboy that was put up in 1921 to honor the 4 Legionnaires killed in the massacre. But in 1999, on the former Elks building, there is a mural that has been painted in commemoration of Wesley Everett and the Wobblies. post-World War I resulted in immediate labor setbacks. Even though the AFL had been as cooperative as they had been. After the war, the AFL actually endorsed and supported a steel strike, but with massive propaganda about how they were unpatriotic, and then the use of strike breakers, spies, armed guards, cooperative police. Big Steel broke the strike, and they didn't gain anything. The blacks were brought in from the South as strike breakers, as well as Mexicans to, as strike breakers. One source says, the Roaring '20s was depicted as this great, wondrous time, but throughout that decade, unemployment rose quietly, almost anonymously, increasing hardships for everybody. The National Association of Manufacturers started a campaign to destroy the unions if they could. And they used the fear of the Bolsheviks as one of their primary tools in this union busting. Is summed up in this statement that was made actually before the war really ended, that the trade union movement was really un-American, illegal, and a conspiracy. Then this pops up in my mailbox a couple weeks ago, and it's a new review of books, the New York Review of Books, what I get. And there's an article here reviewing 4 books. America in the Great War, Library of Congress History, The Great War, well, it's not a book, a 3-part television series. And then War Against War, The American Fight for Peace in 1914-1918. And then Spiderweb, The Birth of American Anti-Communism. And the focus of this article is more really on that last book, I think. It says, the moment the United States entered the war, a second war began at home. Federal agents, local police, vigilantes had 3 main targets. Anyone who might be a German sympathizer, left-wing newspapers and magazines, labor activists. The secondary war went on for at least a year and a half after World War I ended. The war gave business and government the perfect excuse to attack the labor movement. Every IWW office was raided. And a lot of the repression never showed up in statistics because it was done by vigilantes. Bisbee, Arizona. IWW went on strike at a copper mine. The sheriff formed a posse of more than 2,000 mining company officials, hired gunmen, armed local businessmen. They went to round up the miners with a car mounted with a machine gun. They marched nearly 1,200 strikers and their supporters out of town, put them in 24 cattle and freight cars, and accompanying them with armed cars and men, escorted them to New Mexico, where they were put in a U.S. Army stockade. So that's the kind of situation that labor faced, and gives me a greater understanding of kind of like where sort of this anti-communist hysteria that I always kind of wondered about kind of came from. So for any of you paying attention, we have a quiz. Yeah, I figured it'd be too small. Okay, number 1. Joe Hill invented the term wobs, which later became wobblies because he needed a word to rhyme with jobs. Okay. Emma Goodman, Eugene Debs, Helen Keller, and Big Bill Hayward were all members of the IWW. True. Helen Keller was a member. Pie in the sky is a phrase from a Joe Hill song. Emma Goodman and Big Bill Hayward were both deported to Russia. Correct. Bill ran, but Emma was deported. Even though, and it was interesting, you know, she was deported under the Sedition Act, which was to get rid of non-citizens. But she was a citizen, but it's still, they deported her. This is one that's, you got to think about. The Stampers, Joe, Ben, and Hank, the family, and Ken Kesey, sometimes a great notion, were wobbly sympathizers.
I doubt it.
You're correct. They weren't. They were too independent. But wobblies were talked about in there. I showed you the picture of the black cat. That was a symbol that they would use to show or call for even sabotage. And the black cat showed up in a scene or two, and Wobbly's trying to get the Stampers to join them. The Armistice Day riot in this is very important. The Armistice Day riot in Centralia, Washington began because the Legionnaires were University of Washington fans and the Wobblies were all ducks. Yeah, right. So that's all, folks. Yeah.
What does CIO stand for?
I don't know. I don't.
It's the Congress of Industrial Organization.
When did it start?
What? I couldn't hear that. Everybody is.
Congress of Industrial Organization.
Oh, okay.
And it's a coalition of the two biggest coalitions to make it even bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
But isn't that unions now have become a very minor part of the labor landscape? And do you see what do you see for the future of unions in this country? What are your thoughts on that?
Not in the immediate future. In fact, I think I read an article that was kind of related to Alabama and how it's maybe becoming more of a bellwether state, and some of the things that are going on there that are going to make it even more difficult for unions. And then there's definitely a desire to reduce the influence of public employee unions. And, that's I think one of those arguments that isn't black and white. The fact of if you can influence who gets elected, or keep the elected people from making changes that are going to hurt your group, when it comes to the government type of thing, you can see where there could be some argument that that's not a good thing. That they can hold the government in hostage. Yet, I think joining together is the only way that you have some level of power. Somehow we're going to have to work through that, but I think the trend has been to more try to demonize the public employee, and as a means to try to break down the influence that they do have on government officials.
I would think also one of the big things that impacts union is the threat that if you don't shape up, we're just going to take it overseas.
Yes.
Manufacturing, and that's so easy these days.
Mm-hmm. Or even, move it from one city or country or state to another.
Do you think pension plans like PERS, that's so deeply in debt, can consider the black hole is hurting unions as well, some of the bigger pension plans?
Yeah, I think so. When you read about the increase in money that's being earmarked to schools in this state, but then reading where the projections are such that more of that money is going to have to go towards putting aside versus hiring the teachers, that unless there is some kind of responsiveness of working together to try to get the fairest solution for everybody, then that's negative publicity for the union.
Yeah, I think that they've lost a lot of the sympathy. I mean, I knew a guy that retired from one of the local colleges, and he was amazed to me. He said, I retired last year, and he said, I'm making more now from PERS than when I was working.
Yeah, my wife gets a little bit of PERS. She worked with a public health department. I got two daughters that are teachers and don't want to see them hurt. And I think I probably projected a fairly liberal viewpoint here, but in our little beach community, we know at least two couples, both were teachers, that are really living well. And it gives you a little bit of envy there, I guess, a sense of unfairness.
Are you planning to give another talk on the unions since World War II?
No. No, it's just the lady in the back there, my wife.
Those people retired as administrators, so their incomes were much higher than teachers when they retired.
Okay. And
How long did the IWW last?
it still has remnants. It was only as I was sort of researching this that I realized that book I bought about Wobbly several years ago was a 100-year commemoration. And then when you go online, you can actually find Wobbly websites. I don't have any, they must not have very much influence, if you will. But there's people keeping the faith alive. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.